On March 31st, 2016, Japanese video game publisher Square Enix hosted an event called Uncovered Final Fantasy XV. It was a 2-hour-long marketing extravaganza for the upcoming 15th entry in the venerable Final Fantasy franchise, and it was odd. The presentation itself went just fine, but the very fact that it happened was odd. Video games do occasionally get big media blowout events, but rarely are those events themselves so heavily marketed. The event was hosted in the Shrine Auditorium in Los Angeles and streamed live on YouTube and Twitch. The days leading up to the event saw banner ads all over the internet, and there was even a massive ad for it in Waterloo Station, reminding everyone to tune in for the marketing event. The event that we got was lavish by anyone's standards. The video game industry is no stranger to press events like this, but they're not typically dedicated to standalone software releases. Instead, companies like Nintendo or Microsoft host them, and they're intended to outline an entire release forecast instead of detailing one game. Of course, as the event rolled on, we discovered that Uncovered Final Fantasy XV was not about a single software release. It was also about a feature-length CGI movie and a 5-episode animated series, both of which would tie in with the new game. A mobile tie-in game was also announced, and a new demo for Final Fantasy XV was made available for download during the presentation. To say that all this was unusual would be an understatement. The surprises kept coming until the event concluded with the announcement of the game's release date. Final Fantasy XV would be releasing on September 30th, 2016, meaning that the game would be coming out 10 years and 3 months after it was initially announced. No, you heard that right. Final Fantasy XV was originally announced in June of 2006 at the 12th Annual Electronic Entertainment Expo, or E3. And here we are, in 2016. March brought us the announcement of a release date after a 2-hour-long press event that was so heavily marketed that you would have been forgiven for assuming an actual retail product was about to be released. August brought us the announcement that the game had been further delayed until November the 29th of 2016, and finally, November brought us the actual game. The fact is that this game's marketing campaign has been a roller coaster. That's plain enough for even the most casual of observers to see. But what I think is more sinister, and also more interesting about this entire affair, is how this 10-year-long marketing campaign has affected Square Enix as a company, and how it may continue to affect them into the coming years. But to properly discuss how Final Fantasy XV and the marketing campaign of Doom may come to impact Square, we're going to have to go all the way back to 2005. Join me for this archaeological adventure, won't you? In 2005, Square Enix released Kingdom Hearts II, a sequel to the best-selling 2002 original. Though not as big a financial success as the first game, Kingdom Hearts II was still an undeniable hit and would go on to ship 4 million units by the first quarter of 2007. As a result, the game's director, Tetsuya Nomura, and his staff were assigned to work on an entirely new type of project. The project would come to be known as Final Fantasy Versus XIII, a spin-off of the mainline Final Fantasy series. For those unfamiliar with the franchise, each of the Final Fantasy games exists in its own universe and tells a unique story featuring different characters, aesthetics, and locales. The only things that really tie them together are some shared terminology, gameplay mechanics, and, of course, the developer, Square. It's easiest to think of the franchise as a kind of anthology series. In addition to the mainline numbered entries in the series, the Final Fantasy franchise is also home to a number of spin-off titles. Aside from a few rare cases, these spin-off titles have usually been relatively low-budget or niche games, which would pale in comparison to their high-budgeted blockbuster counterparts in the main series. Final Fantasy Versus XIII seemed to be poised to change that. It was announced alongside Final Fantasy XIII as a PlayStation exclusive during Sony's E3 2006 presentation. A beautifully rendered cinematic trailer and the promise of fast-paced action gameplay suggested that Versus XIII wouldn't be a typical Final Fantasy spin-off. However, after the game's initial announcement, news was sparse. The game would skip all major conferences in 2007, and the only sighting of the game came in the form of a short trailer shown only at a fan event. 2008 would see another trailer released at a fan event, and also a trailer released at Tokyo Game Show, Japan's major gaming trade show. Media sources quoted director Tetsuya Nomura as saying that Versus XIII's production had been put on delay so that the team could help with the completion of Final Fantasy XIII proper. Square Enix would later deny this, saying the quote was the result of a translation error. Things proceeded in a similar manner from there. 2009 saw the retail release of Final Fantasy XIII for both PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, but Versus XIII was still mysteriously quiet. A smattering of short trailers appeared at smaller conventions or as bonus features on promotional DVDs, and select members of the press were allowed to view screenshots from the game, but those screenshots weren't actually released to the public. Then, in January of 2011, a 6-minute-long comprehensive gameplay and story trailer for Versus XIII was released. Typically, something like this would have heralded a sudden surge in media presence, but then things got weird. In July of 2011, Tetsuya Nomura stated that the game wasn't in full production quite yet. It would only be in August of the same year that other Square employees would confirm the game had officially entered full production. This all meant that the game was ending its pre-production phase over 5 years after the game's first trailer premiered, which is kind of like, huh? This announcement turned out to be reflective of the inner turmoil that Square was facing as a company and Final Fantasy was facing as a brand. As the Versus XIII non-campaign marched on, the Final Fantasy series at large was far from dormant. As mentioned before, 2009 saw the release of Final Fantasy XIII. Shortly thereafter, in 2010, Final Fantasy XIV, a massively multiplayer online game, would be released for PC. While Final Fantasy XIII was a critical and financial success, Final Fantasy XIV would be critically panned as a product released before it was finished. Backlash was so extreme that Square issued a formal apology to consumers before reducing subscription fees and, eventually, canceling support of the game entirely. Time would reveal that these three games had been tripping over each other from the start. In 2005, Square's technology division began working on a game engine that would eventually become known as the Crystal Tools engine. Initially, Crystal Tools was being developed as a proprietary engine for Final Fantasy XIII, but as Versus XIII and Final Fantasy XIV entered pre-production, the focus was changed. Crystal Tools would instead become Square's in-house development engine for all high-definition games on the upcoming 7th generation consoles, including, bizarrely, the Wii. However, as Final Fantasy XIII's production proceeded, problems started cropping up with the Crystal Tools engine. The engine was being developed alongside the games, and the technology team was spreading themselves so thin by ensuring that the demands of each development team were met that they wound up actively inhibiting the production of 13. Things eventually got so bad that the staff working on Final Fantasy XIII started developing assets that ultimately could not be implemented into the Crystal Tools engine because of a lack of specifications and clear communication between the teams. The technology team was eventually forced to refocus on 13 exclusively. The Crystal Tools engine would ultimately only be used for 5 games, 2 of which would be direct sequels to Final Fantasy XIII, and 1 of which would be Final Fantasy XIV, and, well, Final Fantasy XIV. So yeah, as I said earlier, Final Fantasy XIV was a colossal failure on basically all fronts. Except for that soundtrack. That soundtrack was actually pretty killer. Anyway, Crystal Tools proved unsuited to the needs of a massively multiplayer online game, with Naoki Yoshida going so far as to state that the game's technology rendered the very foundations of the game broken. The team was inexperienced with development for 7th generation consoles and approached the game with antiquated development habits. Many of the game's technical problems were dismissed in hopes that they could be resolved with future patches. It was also said that the team had an unhealthy obsession with graphical quality, which led to incomplete or buggy features being ignored in favor of polishing the game's visual performance. It also prevented more than 20 player characters from being rendered on screen at the same time, which kind of defeated the purpose of a massively multiplayer online game. Though I should stop for a moment just for the sake of fairness and note that not everything was doom and gloom at the offices of Square Enix around this time. While pre-production on Versus XIII proceeded at an apparent snail's pace, director Tetsuya Nomura was far from unproductive. Between 2005 and 2012, Nomura directed and shipped 4 distinct Kingdom Hearts titles. The total increases to 6 if you include the comprehensive remakes of 2 titles in the series. Though all of them were mere spin-off titles that released on handheld systems, they all enjoyed critical and commercial success and set technical milestones for the Nintendo DS, PlayStation Portable, and Nintendo 3DS. Okay, now back to doom and gloom. At this point, Final Fantasy as a brand was in a bit of trouble. The botched release of Final Fantasy XIV would have been bad enough on its own, but the initially positive responses to Final Fantasy XIII started to turn sour. Fans and commentators alike criticized the game for its obtuse story and linear gameplay that harshly restricted player choice. So, in 2011, Square started running damage control on the situation. They commenced development on a complete remake of Final Fantasy XIV from the ground up under the management of a new director, Naoki Yoshida. Frequent and candid communication with both the fanbase and the press became a staple of Yoshida's production, and his statements about the previous iteration of the game and Final Fantasy's shaky situation as a brand were blunt, to say the least. He stated that releasing the new version of the game too early would be at the level of destroying the company, and the team was forced to design yet another engine from the ground up for the new version of 14. Meanwhile, all was quiet on the Versus XIII front, at least as far as the public was concerned, but internally things were more active than they'd probably ever been. It wouldn't be until 2014 and 15 that we found out exactly what was going on in Square's offices during the early days of 2012. As Versus XIII neared 20 to 25% completion, the decision was made to take the game in an entirely new direction. In 2011, the PlayStation 3 was on its last legs, and Square Enix was receiving developer kits for the upcoming PlayStation 4 and Xbox One. The decision was eventually made to shift Versus XIII's development to the next generation of game consoles. This meant abandoning the majority of progress that had been made on the game, as well as abandoning the already antiquated and persistently problematic Crystal Tools engine. As the budget and scale of Versus XIII increased, a number of important changes were made. Number 1. The most obvious, but debatably least important change was one of branding. In July of 2012, Square Enix internally changed Versus XIII's name to Final Fantasy XV, meaning it would now be the next mainline entry in the series instead of a mere spin-off. Number 2. Hajime Tabata was assigned to serve as co-director alongside Tetsuya Nomura. Number 3. The move to next-generation hardware would require a next-generation engine. Development on the newly minted Luminous Studio was commenced, an engine that was intended to support Final Fantasy XV and other 8th-generation console titles from Square Enix. As far as the public was aware, though, none of this was happening. Aside from a few tweets and brief mentions in interviews that Versus XIII was still in development, there were no official statements or announcements regarding the game for more than 2 years. Many industry analysts guessed that Square had quietly cancelled the struggling title. However, at E3 2013, Square finally announced both the switch to next-gen hardware and the rebranding of Versus XIII as Final Fantasy XV. 2013 wound up being a good year for Final Fantasy in general. Not only was the public response to 15's announcement generally positive, but the rebooted Final Fantasy XIV, now dubbed A Realm Reborn Final Fantasy XIV, was a critical and commercial success that still has a large and devoted player base today. Many critics have gone so far as to declare it one of the best Final Fantasy games, and even one of the best MMOs in recent years. Tech demos for the still-in-development Luminous Studio were presented to the press, and the tech looked pretty impressive. All in all, things seem to be improving after years of confusion and disappointment. After 2013, Final Fantasy XV would take another long break from the limelight, but it would return in late 2014 with 2 new trailers and the promise of more frequent communication between the developers and the public. These took the form of live streams hosted by director Tabata and occasionally other members of the staff, where announcements were made and questions from fans were answered. Occasionally, internal development reports were also shown displaying work-in-progress aspects of the game. This newfound openness, alongside a lengthy demo released to the public in spring of 2015, saw a great surge of confidence toward the game from its fans. However, it was also announced in 2014 that Tetsuya Nomura would be stepping down as co-director of Final Fantasy XV, with Hajime Tabata becoming the game's sole director. An official statement from Square Enix said this would allow Nomura to focus his full efforts as the director of other highly anticipated titles, such as Kingdom Hearts 3. We didn't find out exactly what those other highly anticipated titles were until 2015, but, well, we'll come back to that. All of this gets us back around to the present in 2016, with a massive 2-hour media blowout for a game that was announced in 2006, began production in 2011, rebooted in 2013, and switched directors in 2014. Then, on August 15th, director Hajime Tabata appeared in a video to announce to fans that Final Fantasy XV had been delayed. The September 30th release date announced at the Uncovered event had been pushed back to November the 29th to allow for more time to optimize the game's performance. Now, despite all this discussion of Final Fantasy XV, I'm not particularly concerned with how all this stuff has affected 15 as a product. The game is out now, and it's reviewed and sold pretty well. There's been much said about the game's 10-year development and whether or not it's gonna live up to the hype, but it's just not all that important. All that matters is the finished product, and that's what people are really going to remember. That's how hype always works. People spend years of their lives exhausting themselves waiting for something to come out, and then it does, and suddenly all that waiting time seems kind of trivial. So no, I didn't go over all of this just to discuss how it's going to reflect on 15. As I said at the beginning of this video, I feel there's a much more sinister, creeping effect to all of this, and I believe it's going to affect Square Enix in the long term as a company. One of the problems that is already arising from this whole situation is also the most predictable. The engine being developed for Final Fantasy XV Luminous Studio, like Crystal Tools before it, has been having persistent technical problems. I should be clear, in terms of visual performance, Luminous is pretty impressive, and it may very well be a quality game engine when it's finished, and that's part of the problem. Instead of developing Final Fantasy XV for a pre-existing system, Luminous and 15 were being developed in tandem, meaning that the game was running on an incomplete engine for much of its development time. As one might expect from a setup like this, Luminous seemed to be proving just as troublesome as Crystal tools. This was reflected in 2 demos released before the game proper, both of which had stuttering frame rates and other performance issues. While the final product has mostly resolved its frame rate issues, it's still not a technical powerhouse. The Xbox One version of the game has a dynamic resolution that caps at 900p, and the anti-aliasing is a mess across both Xbox and PlayStation, especially with regards to the hair, and there's a lot of hair in this game. Thing is, there's more going on here than just some simple nerdy technical issues. Initially, Kingdom Hearts 3 was also being developed on Luminous Studio, but in April of 2014, almost a year after the game was announced, co-director Taiga Sue announced the game would be switching from Luminous to Unreal 4, an engine developed by Epic Games, an American company unaffiliated with Square Enix. While we don't know exactly when Kingdom Hearts 3 started development, we do know that it wasn't a Versus XIII-esque situation where the development started after the announcement, so we can assume that at least a year of work went into the Luminous version of Kingdom Hearts 3 before the development switched to Unreal. Then, in December of 2015, it was announced that the upcoming Final Fantasy VII Remake would also be using Unreal 4 in favor of Luminous Studios. This means that of the 3 biggest upcoming releases from Square Enix, only one of them is actually using the game engine built by Square. To be completely fair, this could be a positive thing. The development of Crystal Tools was stunted because it was trying to cater to so many different projects, so allowing the developers of Luminous to focus on a specific project, in this case Final Fantasy XV, could mean that Luminous winds up being a powerful engine that gets used for future Square Enix projects. But as of right now, there are no plans to use Luminous on any specific titles other than Final Fantasy XV, at least as far as we know. Square Enix has trademarked Luminous Studio Pro, which I can only assume is a version of the engine that is more finished than the one seen in Final Fantasy XV, but there have been no official details regarding the engine's state of completion as of the time of this video's release. What we do know is that Final Fantasy XV's technical performance is slightly above average at best and underwhelming for current-gen games at worst. 15 is a beautiful game, but it won't be setting any technical milestones, and it raises the question of why spending all of this time and money on Luminous was needed in the first place. But what's the point of all this technical nonsense, you may fairly ask? Why are we talking about this? Well, here's why. Luminous was developed because Square wants to prove their relevance in the global market. The 7th console generation was a rough time for Japanese developers in general. They used to be the premier market for games, but Microsoft's Xbox 360 dominated the North American market and ran a close race with Sony's PlayStation 3 in Europe. Japanese games were on the decline in terms of sales and also in terms of technical performance. Previously, all of the best games came out of Japan. Now they come out of California and Montreal. It's obvious that Square wanted Luminous to be their premier next-gen engine. It was supposed to be the machine that would catapult their games and, consequently, their company back to global relevance. But all they've accomplished is reinforcing the notion that Japanese developers can't handle this kind of stuff. Games like Konami's Metal Gear Solid 5 prove that is sometimes an unfair and unearned assumption, but it is still a very popular assumption that Japanese developers are fighting to overcome. In 2012, Square's technical director Yoshihisa Hashimoto said, "From his perspective, Square Enix exists because of the high end." He also said that he believes Japanese developers are capable of producing interesting games, but looking at the influence, we are being pushed around by the Western games without a doubt. He used the words pushing back to describe what the Japanese game industry was starting to do with technology like Konami's Fox engine and Square's then early in development Luminous Studio. Square has never been in the business of selling its engines to other companies, so it's hard to assess exactly how much the perceived failure of 2 in-house engines will affect the studio financially. But it doesn't seem like that was ever the point with Luminous Studios. If Luminous was a bid to prove that Japanese game developers, specifically Square Enix, could compete with the international developers when it came to their technical capabilities, well, switching 2 of your biggest products to an American engine is just about the most counterproductive thing a company can do. For a company that seems to pride themselves on how technologically advanced their products are, turning out an engine that isn't as powerful or easy to use as the American-made competition can't look good to consumers or to shareholders. Obviously, I can't say anything for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see layoffs or major reorganization of Square's technology division after the development of Luminous Studio Pro crosses the finish line. I just don't see much of a future for a Square Enix-made game engine, and it's become pretty obvious that the ridiculous marketing and business decisions surrounding Versus XIII and the original version of 14 are at least partially to blame for the failings of Crystal Tools and Luminous Studio. While it may be hard to assess the situation regarding Luminous Studio from the outside, what's a lot easier to see is how this entire 10-year fiasco has affected the reputation of one of Square's top game directors, Tetsuya Nomura. Now, I've got to admit that this section of the video is going to be a little bit less heavily researched, less specific. I don't really have any exact numbers or, scientific studies to back up what I'm talking about here. Instead, I'm just going to go off what I've observed myself over the last several years on the internet. And I think I'm in a pretty good position to do that since I've devoted a decent amount of my time to talking about this game on YouTube, and I've read a lot of comments about the subject just on my videos, let alone all the forum threads and articles and reaction videos and just everything, man. I've been living and breathing this scene for the last 3 years. I might as well put all this knowledge to good use on something. So we haven't exactly talked much about the public reaction to this game's marketing across the last decade, but suffice to say it wasn't overwhelmingly positive. I should clarify. Reaction to individual trailers was usually positive. Square is pretty reliable when it comes to churning out exciting trailers, but that's not what I'm talking about. As Versus XIII danced in and out of the spotlight, the game's content seemed to change and characters or plot points vanished entirely, and there were a lot of questions flying around as to what exactly was going on in Square's offices. Why was it taking so long to make one game? Why did so many of the press releases and trailers seem disconnected from one another? When the directorial baton passed from Tetsuya Nomura to Hajime Tabata in 2014, lots of people took it as confirmation that Nomura was the problem. This wasn't the only gripe people had with Nomura. You remember how I said that he made a game called Kingdom Hearts 2 right before he got the job to make Versus XIII? Yeah, well, a lot of fans really liked that game, and they were looking forward to a theoretical Kingdom Hearts 3. Turns out that wasn't in the cards. As I said earlier, between 2009 and 2012, Nomura directed and released no less than 4 Kingdom Hearts games, but not one of them had the big 3 in the title. They were all spin-offs. Kingdom Hearts 358 over 2 days in 2009, Birth by Sleep Encoded in 2010, and Dream Drop Distance in 2012. Oh, and yes, those are their real names. I know. While those games all reviewed fairly well, and plenty of hardcore fans were happy to get anything with their favorite name on the cover, lots of other gamers have been sitting around, scratching their heads, wondering when the true sequel, whatever that means, to Kingdom Hearts 2 would finally arrive. That, along with the lengthy, confusing, seemingly completely incompetent development of Versus XIII, has led the internet to one conclusion. Tetsuya Nomura can't ship games. I should be clear about one thing before I go any further with this. We don't know what happened behind the scenes at Square during the development of Versus XIII and the early years of 15. All we know is what I told you earlier, so it is entirely possible that Nomura is an incompetent fool who doesn't know how to direct or release modern games on time, but that seems kind of unlikely considering he directed and released 4 other games during the course of Versus XIII's development. Taking Nomura off the 15 project and handing the reins to Tabata could certainly have been the executives doing damage control and trying to get an overly ambitious or incompetent director out of the way of an expensive project, but if that was the case, then they probably wouldn't have made him the director of this.
Wait for it. Yes! Play it first!
So yeah, I'm not a businessman, but if I was and there was someone causing consistent problems for my next-gen big-budget game, I'd stick him back in his little Kingdom Hearts corner where he has experience and a co-director to keep him on track. I probably wouldn't give him control of a game that is so highly anticipated that it probably could have been considered one of the most anticipated games of all time before it was even conceived by the people actually making it. Yeah, for those who are not aware, funny story. Back in 2005, Square Enix released a little tech demo for the then brand new PlayStation 3, where they recreated the opening scene of Final Fantasy VII using new graphics technology. This tech demo circulated without context around the internet, and before long the gaming community at large had stirred itself up into a frenzy over the idea of a remake of the beloved 1997 game. Never mind the fact that Square had done tech demos exactly like this for the Nintendo 64 and PlayStation 2 featuring some of their other beloved games, no! Even after word that the game was just a tech demo had circulated properly and Square released official statements saying that there were no plans to remake 7, the excitement and demand for this non-existent product was palpable for the better part of 10 years until it was officially announced in 2015. Then, the internet did what it does best and promptly started arguing about just how Square should and should not make this game they weren't even going to make in the first place that everyone has been dreaming about about for the last 10 years. People started releasing articles about how the remake would ruin the original's legacy, and people got into furiously heated debates about whether or not the game should change things from the original, or how much things should be changed, or how much before it was ruined, or if the remake was actually going to be the worst thing ever, or Cloud should be allowed cross-dressing Cloud should exactly be in the game, should Genesis definitely shouldn't be in there, that guy sucks. What are we supposed to have, how are we gonna remake Final Fantasy VII? Hey, has anybody seen my monkey paw? Have you seen my monkey paw? Anyway, back to the discussion at hand. Yes, Nomura could be an incompetent director who doesn't know what he's doing, but in terms of the actual evidence that we, the public, have, I at least find this hard to believe. I'm sure we'll probably never get the full story of what happened with Versus XIII, and I'm equally sure that Nomura carries some of the blame for what happened with it. But from the evidence that we have, it seems more like the game's problems stem from mismanagement at a higher level, poor allocation of resources, and an announcement that came something like 6 years too early. Even in the hypothetical scenario where Nomura was the one who asked to release the trailer in 2006, there still should have been some executive somewhere to veto that decision. But the facts don't really matter in this case. Much like how fans whipped themselves up into a frenzy over a remake of a game that was never announced, people have been eagerly anticipating Kingdom Hearts 3 since 2005, even though the game wasn't formally announced until 2013. The perceived long wait for Kingdom Hearts 3 and the actual long and confused wait for Versus XIII have, as I said, given Nomura a reputation for being unable to finish big-budget games.
Not Nomura. They'll never come
I'm
out.
okay with them.
They'll never come out.
Now, I know what you may be saying, this is all fine and good, but why are we talking about it? Well, it seems fairly obvious to me that the executives at Square Enix value Nomura to some degree. They're putting him in charge of pretty important projects, and they feature his name prominently on anything that even has characters he designed. The point is that if he was incompetent, they'd fire him, and if they didn't want him to have positive brand value, they would hide him. He wouldn't be conducting interviews, and you certainly wouldn't see his name attached so prominently to so many products. But here, Square is sabotaging themselves yet again. For all the evidence that we, the public, actually have, it's hard to say if Nomura was responsible for the messy development of Versus XIII. Maybe he was, but whatever, it really doesn't matter because none of us would even be aware of this situation if Square hadn't horribly botched the announcement and development cycle of Versus XIII. If Square had, decided that they shouldn't produce an elaborate trailer for a game that hadn't entered production and instead maybe, announced it in 2011 after they properly started working on it, then this entire debacle would have been avoided. All of it. Literally all of it. The reputation of the company, the reputation of one of its most prominent directors, the question of whether or not the company can competently produce modern games or game development engines, we wouldn't be talking about any of this. At the end of the day, Final Fantasy XV is one game. Yeah, it's important. There are people sitting in an office at Square literally right now watching its sales numbers and deliberating on what they should do next with the franchise, but all of this stuff we're talking about has a much, much wider reach than just one game. Of course, if you don't care about all that big picture stuff, we can also see how this is affecting 15 as a product. Even though it's receiving fairly positive reviews, many people are saying the game feels incomplete, a sentiment the developers apparently agree with if their forecast of updates is any indication. The game is also rife with product placement. Final Fantasy has dabbled in product placement before, with Cloud using a Panasonic Foma P900 IV in the movie follow-up to Final Fantasy VII, and Lightning pimping Louis Vuitton products, but this stuff has never bled over into the games themselves before, and never quite so systemically. The main characters all use Coleman-branded camping equipment and eat cup noodle by the actual literal truckload. The gas stations in the world of Final Fantasy XV apparently accept American Express cards, and if you watch the tie-in movie, then you know that when it comes to cars, the King's Royal Knights won't settle for anything less than Audi. And all of this is without mentioning that the outfits the main characters wear were designed by Japanese fashion house Rowan, and you can actually buy 2 of them right now. I'm not really sure if any of that stuff could have been avoided if the reveal of Versus XIII had come at a more reasonable time in the game's production cycle. They still would have spent a lot of money on the project, so they still probably would have needed to make all those deals to recoup costs. And again, I really don't mind all the promotional stuff in the game, it's more amusing than obnoxious.
Then, if you take something already delicious like cup noodles and add in the finest, freshest ingredients, what do you get? The ultimate flavor experience.
Like I said, I really don't care about that stuff. It's not as if Square hasn't done other things in recent years to damage their reputation, but it sure seems like a lot of their biggest problems can be traced back to everything that has gone on in the public eye with Versus XIII and 15. Yeah, Final Fantasy XIII and the original version of 14 were problems, and they did have a big impact on the company's reputation. But there, the negative backlash was a response to products that Square actually sold. Here, we're seeing all this damage not because of a bad product, but because Square's marketing team failed to appropriately control its own story. I'm not talking about all of this as some kind of indictment of Square's leadership or marketing department. I am coming here with the benefit of hindsight. I'm sure that if I had been in a position of authority at Square, I probably would have made a lot of the same decisions. Probably even worse ones, since, I have no practical experience working for a multinational entertainment corporation. I'm not trying to pick on anyone, I just wanted to try and examine and understand the fallout of the corporate communications surrounding this game. My intent here is not to point fingers. I'm just hoping that we can all learn something, both about public relations and about how unbridled hype isn't always a positive thing for companies or consumers. If we'd never heard of Versus XIII and Final Fantasy XV was announced for the first time in 2013, then when Nomura was taken off his co-director position in 2014, no one would have batted an eye. As it is, Square has inadvertently and possibly irreparably damaged the reputation of a man who they clearly want to have positive brand value. If we'd heard about the game 4 or 5 years ago instead of 10 years ago, then there wouldn't be quite as much scrutiny coming down on the game. As it is, we've got people saying, oh wow, after 10 years of development, Square Enix managed to turn out a 7 to 8 out of 10 perfectly competent but unexceptional game that any other studio could have managed in half the time. Of course, we now know that most of the development on Versus XIII was scrapped, and Final Fantasy XV really only began production in 2012 or thereabouts, but like I was saying earlier, the facts don't matter. All that matters is the perception of the public, and it's the job of a marketing team to control the perception of the public. And so, this is the situation we find ourselves in. This is what Square is going to have to deal with now and into the future. All because of a few short-sighted marketing decisions. All because so many gamers love trailers and hype just as much as they love actual games. All because a trailer released 5 years too early. All because Square Enix and their fans have such a deep, unhealthy love for 3 simple words.
Please be excited for E3 this year. Thank you so much. See you soon. Bye.
I can't believe it's all over. What do we do now? What do you mean? Now we can finally play the game. Oh yeah,